In 2013, the story of a remarkable 11-year-old took up the covers of 5 issues of the New York Times. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Andrea Elliott introduced Dani Coates with all of her resilience, intelligence, and potential, bringing a human face to the city's population of homeless children. In her new book, Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City, Elliott expands on her New York Times series. Following Dani and her family for close to 10 years, Invisible Child is a heartbreaking but ultimately inspiring story of one little girl, but also a moving investigation on the impact of structural racism and the many ways our support systems fail to help vulnerable families. For today's conversation, Andrea Elliott is joined by Chris Kremeyer, President and CEO of Beyond Housing, a community development organization dedicated to creating a stronger, more equitable St. Louis for all.
Hello, this is Chris Kremeyer, President and CEO of Beyond Housing. Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with author Andrea Elliott, whose new book just came out, The Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. How are you, Andrea?
I'm very well and so happy to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, could you maybe tell us a little bit about kind of the genesis of the book? You're an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and this kind of spawned from that, and then 7-8 years later, there's a book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so sure. It all began in October of 2012 when, as a reporter for the New York Times, I was standing outside a homeless shelter in Brooklyn. And I was trying to find a way into a really big story, which was the city's homeless crisis. And specifically also the city's population of children who were living that crisis every day. At that time, there were more than 22,000 children in the city's shelters. And I just wanted to find one. And I'll never forget the moment I saw Dani and her family. They were walking out of the shelter. Her mom was at the front, walking like a drill sergeant, and her children were right behind her in single line formation. And something about that image just grabbed me immediately and has stayed with me ever since, because it says so much about them as a family, that they relied on one another. And that they had such a strength in their bond and such an attitude of community. I from the very beginning just noticed that about Dani in particular, that she was constantly putting everyone else ahead of herself. Yeah. And that wasn't because she thought it was a principled thing. It was just how you existed in this family. You were a part of a collective. And she just stood out. She was 11 years old and she grabbed my attention. Everything that came out of her mouth, I wanted to write down. She was precocious and funny and smart. And she was on the honor roll at her school, athletic, so many talents that from the outside, you'd think, oh, this kid's a superstar. And when you get inside her life, you go back into the shelter, into her real life, which is one room crammed with 10 family members. It's a mouse-infested room because the city, which funded the shelter, had let it fall apart. You just see the limits of her life and the fact that she wasn't able to be the star that she could have been because she was so, she was struggling so much just to get through the day. And so this book is very much about one girl's survival as she comes of age. So many things happened. It's why it took as long as it did, almost a decade, because I continued to just be totally surprised by the things that would happen to this family, and then the way that they, and Dani in particular, rose to the challenge again and again, and just reached within herself and got this strength to get through. But nothing about it was predictable. Nothing about the story is predictable.
Early in the book, Dani had a quote that said, "I have a lot of possibilities. I do." At the beginning of this journey, trying to tell the story, I'm sure you're aware that systems didn't work well. But as you followed this family for 7 years, were you surprised at how badly the systems were broken?
The answer in one word is yes. I had no idea how flawed some of these systems were until I was walking alongside the family to get into these buildings, standing in line with them, spending, at one point, we were in one of the buildings for homeless families for 12 hours, and both Dasani's mother and I fell asleep, and Dasani took a photograph of us. I was usually the one documenting her, but that was a funny moment in which she turned the tables. You don't know what it's like until you're inside, and you can't fully be inside as an outsider. I am ultimately always going to be an outside observer, but I did spend hours and hours and hours, years of my time walking the path with them. The poor, people often say, want to live off of the government, or they are dependent because they're lazy. These are the kinds of tropes that are out there. The poor pay with their time. And this is maybe the first major revelation I had, is like so many hours just spent standing in line. Chanel and Supreme, her parents, would have done anything to work. There were some real issues that kept them from working that were personal, but also public. I mean, they had criminal backgrounds that made it much harder to even find work, even though they hadn't been doing anything, that was a serious crime for a really long time. They were in drug treatment programs, but they were just constantly struggling. They could have qualified for disability benefits, which would have brought a lot of income, but they didn't want to carry the stigma of that label.
You mentioned time, and I think most folks don't really understand kind of what it takes. So maybe describe, as an example, if Chanel and all of her children were late getting back to the homeless shelter, describe what they had to do to get back into the homeless shelter, because they'll let you in and you're homeless. What are you supposed to do? I mean, it's the greatest irony, right? Describe to folk kind of the inaneness of, again, time, and what a family and a mom with these children, what she had to do to get back into the shelter.
This is a really good question. It really goes to the lack of humanity in the process, what happened to them always when they were late, which is that they got logged out. Even the language around some of this stuff it doesn't feel, it feels like a computer's in charge. You're logged out, so then you need to get logged back in. What does that mean? Logged out means you missed a curfew, the doors are shut. You now need to get on a train to a different part of the city, to the intake office.
With that line of children, right? Not just her herself, right? Yeah, all the children.
If you miss your curfew, you get logged out, and you must report to an intake center in a different part of town to get logged back in. You may have to spend the night in what they call emergency overnight shelter, which is not your shelter. It's not with your things. And this was at a time when all the children had to go no matter what. They had to miss school. The policy changed a little bit after this, the series I wrote for the New York Times ran that led to this book. The book covers a much broader arc. Even just the disruption that's caused from having to then spend the night in a foreign place. So this was the kind of thing that was just slowly eating away at this family.
In the book, you chronicle a lot of people in Dasani's life. I was fascinated about grandmother Joni, mom Chanel, and then Dasani, right? The love that she got and gave back to the matriarchs of the family was really powerful. But Dasani also saw their flaws and the demons that kind of came along with them. Talk a little bit about those relationships and how both their strength, Joni's and Chanel's strength, was helpful, but how some of the other challenges that grandma and mom faced, how that impacted Dasani.
As she put it, I didn't have, she kind of said at one point, I didn't have family, so the street became my family. She did have family, but it was a very dysfunctional family. I do think that this book has a universal story in it for everyone. I mean, we all have families. We all know what the ins and outs are of being in a family. As Mary Carr, and I love to quote her, says, the definition of a dysfunctional family is more than any family with more than one member. So, we can all relate to being annoyed by our moms, right? Dasani and I would bond over this because she would hear me on the phone with my mother speaking Spanish because my mother's from Chile, and we would bicker and then we would laugh. And, there's so much texture to that relationship when you're close. And I think what I want people to see is that texture when they read this, and to see that people can be many things at once. We're not just all one thing. This monolithic treatment of especially the poor as a story of suffering or as a family that is dysfunctional, rather than suffering in the background contrasted with joy. There's a lot of joy in this story and a lot of levity. And this family is functional in extraordinary ways and also dysfunctional.
Right.
Here's how they're functional. I mean, there's many ways, I would say, but I can't think of a mother I know who has 8 kids who can keep everything straight in her head the way that Chanel did, or who just knows automatically, even if she's fallen asleep on the train, to open her eyes because they've gotten to the right stop. She had this kind of internal barometer and this set of instincts that I thought really was astonishing, given that she wasn't someone who wore a watch, and she had a lot of dysfunction in the way she handled things sometimes, but ultimately she survived, and she was always trying to provide for the kids.
And again, I think that notion of the strength it takes, quite frankly, to be poor, right? The mental strength, the physical strength, what it takes to survive. Again, I think most folks just don't really understand or have anywhere near the appreciation that they should, given again the context of someone's challenging life. Dani gets this, what would seem on the outside, this great opportunity to go to this wonderful boarding school, the Hershey School in Hershey, Pennsylvania. But that comes with some real difficulties as it relates to leaving her family, right? Trying to better herself, leaving her family, because de facto, as you say in the book, she's the second mother. And sometimes she does a lot of the parenting for her younger siblings. Talk a little bit about this, both this opportunity, but this almost existential crisis, right? Do I strive for myself, and then do I, understand that my family could be falling apart? And on some levels, they did while she was gone. Talk a little bit about that.
I like that you describe it as an existential struggle. That is exactly right. I think that the central tension throughout this book, the big crucible that Dani lives out, is this having to reconcile her deep love and bond with her family and loyalty to her family, and at the same time,
because they speak about it all the time. All throughout the whole book, it's family. We stay together. We always stay, no matter what, we stay together.
Exactly. This is her system of survival. And it's also where she finds fulfillment. It's not just survival. It's just so central to her identity and something she's proud of. And at the same time, wanting to reach for a life that is not defined by the problems that defined her family's life. How do you reconcile those two things? What are you going to do? Do you leave? Do you stay? What happens if you stay? What happens if you leave? We see both of those things play out. For Dani, succeeding required something else. It required remaining close to the family while reaching for something more. That to her felt like the most authentic way to get ahead. That you don't lose an essential part of yourself just because that's what society tells you you need to do. You need to act differently. You need to speak differently. You need to dress differently. You can't say ain't anymore. You have to say isn't. These were the things that she was learning in this new setting. And there are arguments either way. There are some of her great Black mentors said to her, you need to learn to code switch. You need to learn to be able to do these things, to swim in different oceans. And that just opens up your horizons. I don't think Dani disagrees with that. It's just that she found it so painful because once she left, her family fell apart. Her mother is often rankled by the description that Dani gives of her role in the family. Dani, and I also witnessed this, sees herself as another parent. I saw that myself, but of course that's a stinging, notion to the parent. The parent doesn't necessarily want to admit that. I'm a mom. I rely a lot on my 13-year-old with my younger kid. I wouldn't want anyone to tell me that she's like another parent, but maybe sometimes it's true.
And listening to you talk, in Dani's mind, would you say success has to be a family goal, not an individual goal? I mean, success just can't be hers, right? Because that's not how she views the world, right? She views the world. Yes, there's some things she does individually really well. She's really bright and really smart. She runs track. She's a cheerleader. She has some individual success. But in her mind, unless somehow her family not come along with her, but had was part of a successful life, then she was whole. Because if it was just her and not them, then it wasn't success to her.
Yes, I think she feels that she must share in any success, that she wants to lift them up with her siblings in particular. When she left, things did fall apart. You can't deny that. Was it coincidence or was there a causal relationship? Dani thought it was causal. She thought that if she hadn't left, her family would still be together. Instead, her siblings wound up in foster care.
Right. So one of the thematic things in the book is this kind of journey throughout, the 5 boroughs of New York. And then there's a map that kind of talks about this, literally this journey from where they live to Staten Island. By the way, I was born in Staten Island. So again, their journey. So kind of talk about, the travels, the journey, not a simple task, right? Again, you talked about time. Right. So some of their journeys on ferry boats and trains and just to get to school and all these other things. Talk a little bit about, their journey amongst the 5 boroughs in New York City.
I love this question. When I started out this path of reporting on Dani's life, I regarded her, like most people did, as quote unquote, a homeless girl, a girl without a home. I think if I take anything away from this time with Dani, it is that she is a person who deeply belongs in New York. The book opens with this map of Dani's Fort Greene. And the reason that this map exists is because one day, as I was trying to wade through some of the policy stuff and I was kind of frustrated, I met up with Dani and she could tell that I was hitting some kind of wall in my writing. And she said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I just don't know how to describe how these systems of your life interact in your, or how to even like show to the reader, like how they exist in your life physically." And she closed her eyes and she saw a map and she started to describe it to me. And it was a map I already knew because I'd been to these places with her. Welfare is in Queens. Homeless services is in the Bronx. Child protection is in Brooklyn. And so it was like having her map out for me this alternate view of the city, this parallel map that if you're poor.
Right.
And it's not the map that tourists see. And it's the same New York. It's the same geography, but different points of focus. And I thought that was so important to capture.
Talk about, because you paint such a wonderful picture when the book opens up about how she starts her day looking out the window at the Auburn homeless shelter. Describe that a little bit, because that was just such a great visual. I think both of her and this irony of, I'm in this homeless shelter that's in terrible shape and I'm looking out the window.
This is what she did.
Yeah.
From the moment I met her, Dani told me early on, she had this morning routine where she would get up before everyone else, because once they were up, she was helping. She was helping get the bottle and change the diaper and get her siblings fed and dressed, get them to school on time, often missing breakfast herself. But before all of that, when everyone was still asleep, she had her quiet moment of the morning in which she'd go to her windowsill and she'd look at the Empire State Building. And I saw it. I saw the view. And it was it helped me describe it in the book so well, was to be able to envision this every morning, this routine. But what was so moving about it wasn't just the fact that she was looking at this building that is so iconic. It's the first skyscraper to reach more than 100 floors in New York history. As she put it to me, it makes me feel like there's something going on out there. And I think that that is so much the heartbeat of this book, is her reaching for something better.
You said trust is not a destination.
That's right.
So talk about, your relationship with Dani and, quite frankly, the rest of this family, because for 7-8 years, you were with them.
I believe trust is a constant work in progress. You should never take it for granted. It is so complicated. And at the same time, there's something about our relationship that is ultimately quite simple. I just kept showing up. And you, as somebody who works with people in economic disadvantage, you know this. There's almost nothing that counts as much as the person who doesn't bail. The person who just checks in once a week, who's not going to vanish. And some of the most well-meaning adults in Dani's life, people who are doing wonderful things as teachers, they couldn't help but vanish, because guess what? They changed jobs, or Dani had to move. Dani moved through 8 different shelters by the time she went to boarding school. Yeah. So this constant disruption means that relationships are not understood to be lasting for the most part. Family is everything. But the non-family person who shows up, I think that over the years, it was just that. More than anything, it was the fact that I didn't go away.
Yeah, you weren't transitory, right? You were there. You were in essence permanent de facto for those 7-8 years.
I was constantly there.
Mm.
And I witnessed a lot of things that I think also the fact that I was there for these really painful things helped to establish a kind of understanding between us. It's like when you go through something with a friend, or somebody happens to be there who you're not even that close to, who witnesses something, it brings you closer.
I've heard you say that your sense of this sacrosanct of the journalist and those are covering can't get too close. It may be time to at least rethink that a little bit. Could you talk about that?
I think in the beginning of my career, and for a long time, I believed that as a journalist, you wear the journalist hat, and the person that you're interviewing is the person answering the questions. And there's this divide. You don't cross that divide because your work potentially is at stake. Your balance, your sense of scope, your ability to be fair. It's really important to strive for balance and depth in our reporting. There's no question. But I think what I've come to realize is that not only is it okay to have really big feelings about the things that you are witnessing, it is arguably essential to the process. It allows for a kind of transmission of narrative onto the page that keeps the reader awake and feels alive and feels urgent. I think you can't do that. The kind of writing that I admire and love, you can't do that unless you surrender to the humanity that you represent, not just the reporting, but the humanity.
Right. No, as I read it, I heard and felt your emotions in it, but it was very much in a tertiary background way, and it never got in the way of the storytelling, right? I mean, I never thought, oh, well, Andrea's getting sucked into this and now she's not. No, I heard you again. It was never, you always very kind of short and crisp with a little bit of you, but I never thought it got in the way of the storytelling, which I thought was wonderful. 2 last questions. If you had a magic policy wand that you could wave over kind of the lives of Dani, her family, and so many others, what are the top 2 or 3 things that you'd like to do? And then the last question is tell us about Dani and her family today.
Because I'm not a policymaker, I'm a journalist. I want people of all backgrounds across the political spectrum, across lines of race, class, ethnicity, to read this book and see what it inspires in them. The big takeaway for me is that we have all these assumptions about the poor, that they don't want to work, for example, or that they can't be bothered to parent properly. These are often thoughts that people keep to themselves, but they have them. And all you have to do is spend a little time with Dani's family, and you start to second guess all of these things. I mean, these are parents who are struggling with the problems of poverty, but who are so proud to be parents and who love their children so much. It isn't for a lack of love that they wind up losing their kids. I was struck by how important public education is, as not just the thing it is, which is education, which is so vital, but as all these other things it provides, right? It is arguably the greatest anti-poverty program in the United States. It's the place where children find food and shelter and sometimes clothing and surrogate parents. And so that is an essential place to look in terms of investments, clearly. Obviously, the lack of affordable housing is a major issue in this country. And then when we look at poor families who are monitored by child protection, there's so much more that's spent on separating families, on separating children from their parents, than on programs that support the family staying together. That is really stunning to me, that there's such a disparity in federal spending between those two things.
Right. You'll be happy to know I have 12 staff people embedded in our local school system here that do nothing, not a lick of education. It's about clothes and school uniforms and food and rent assistance and all that stuff that gets in the way of children living their best possible lives. So lastly, tell us about a little bit about Dani's family. Dani today is 19?
So Dani is now 20. The book
20.
ends this year, so it's quite current. Yeah. You'll see where she is in the book. The developments after the book are that she not only was the first of the children to graduate from high school in her family, but now is in college. Part of her family did come back together, so she's now with her mother and 2 of her siblings. And she started community college, and she's majoring in business administration. She still has the same dream. Nice. And she's reaching for success on her own terms. She's trying to have it both ways. She wants to stay with her family and keep her city central, her version of New York City life, which isn't everyone's, her neighborhood, her people, inside her heart at the same time as she is reaching for a better life. And that's what she's trying.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. If you want to get your own copy of Andrea's wonderful book, The Invisible Child, it's available at Left Bank Books.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to read a very short section from the first chapter. Slipping out from her covers, Dani goes to the window. On mornings like this, she can see all the way past Brooklyn, over the rooftops and the projects and the shimmering East River. Her eyes can travel into Manhattan, to the top of the Empire State Building, the first New York skyscraper to reach 100 floors. This is the type of fact that she recites in a sing-song, look what I know way. She fixes her gaze on that distant temple, its tip pointed celestially, its facade lit with promise. It makes me feel like there's something going on out there, she says. I have a lot of possibility. I do, though. I have a lot of things to say.